Anyway, uh, welcome to a new world of PowerPoint with Zoom. I have 120 photos, so I'll go through them fairly quickly. Hopefully I'm speaking loud enough.
Yep, good.
So this is basic shorebird ID. I tried to get good photos. Sometimes they're not the best, but we'll see how this works out. So initially, I wanted to say, what is a shorebird? And they belong to a large order of birds, the Charadriformes, which includes Jaegers, gulls, terns, and a few others. They're distributed throughout the world. Most of them, of course, spend their time near water, but we do have upland species like woodcock and upland sandpiper. They usually nest on the ground. And the young are precocial, meaning when they hatch, they have a lot of downy feathers to insulate them, and they can start feeding usually within a few hours of hatching, which is certainly not the case for birds that are not precocial. At this point, we have 38 species of shorebirds documented in Mason County. That's pretty good, considering there are only 45 species documented for the whole state of Michigan. And then continent-wise, 63 species of shorebirds are documented. I'm not sure if that includes some things like European lapwings or not. I have a couple slides on topography or the different aspects of a shorebird. I'm not going to go into great detail, but some of these are common sense. The nape is the back of the head. That can be handy. Some of the technical terms of tertials and scapulars, that's for shorebirds 101 or 102 or 201. So probably won't talk too much about that, but the flanks would be the side of the bird. Breast and belly, pretty self-explanatory. The mantle just means the back. Primaries are the major flight feathers, and then you have covert feathers, the greater, median, and lesser coverts. Those just, the greater coverts are larger than the median, and the medium are larger than the lesser. So those just cover the larger feathers. And then just briefly, a different diagram here to show the primaries are in the outer part of the wing. The secondaries are the inner part of the wing. And then you have a better idea of where the coverts are, the coverts, the mantle is the back, and then above the tail are the upper tail coverts. So those are kind of the basic things there. Scapulars are kind of a shoulder area, I would say. Top shorebird rarities. It's kind of interesting, just based on the number of birds. We've only had one black-necked stilt ever reported in the county back in 2018. We only had one Hudsonian godwit ever, only one snowy plover, only one red phalarope. However, those are the only species that are represented by one record. With red ruff, we have two records, 1975 and 2010. The 2010 was during the spring bird count when I saw one at the wastewater treatment plant. But the bird, when I went back to get my camera from the car and came back, it got frightened away, and I really didn't have time to try to track it down. And then we've had one historic record of redneck phalarope. That was a Bob Mormon record of two birds on Nordhaus Lake. And then 2017, statewide, almost Great Lakes wide, there was a big influx of redneck phalaropes. Basic things for shorebirding, obviously you want good binoculars. Spotting scope, however, is pretty critical if you want to be serious. Fortunately, nowadays you have a lot more variety in spotting scopes as far as cost and quality. And your spotting scope is only as good as your tripod. So if you get a scope, you need a sturdy tripod. And then, of course, it helps to have both a general guide to birds as well as some special books on shorebirds, which we'll show at the end of the program. So here we have some yellowlegs with some smaller shorebirds. First group are stilts and avocets, and we have two halfway decent photos of the black-necked stilt that Linda Scribner discovered. And this happens to be her photo of the stilt from quite a ways. It was probably 200 yards or more from US 31. And Linda was able to get a pretty decent photo of this southern rarity. And then we have a nice photo from Mark Willock of an aerial bird in flight there. But again, it helps to have a really huge lens and a little bit of luck. Then my favorite shorebird, the American avocet, arguably the most colorful, elegant shorebird in breeding plumage, as you can see. The legs are kind of bluish gray. The neck is salmon colored, bold black and white wings, and a long, elegant black upturned bill. And avocets in winter, we don't see much. So these birds are in winter plumage, and it's very rare to have avocets anywhere in the state of Michigan in late October. But last fall, 10 of them showed up, and it was really cool. I was able to get quite a few people to see those. Lapwings and plovers. We have no lapwings in Mason, but we have plovers. So black-bellied plover, one of the uncommon plovers in migration. And in flight, separating black-bellied from golden plover is easy, even from a distance, because what you want to do is look underneath in the armpit area where my cursor is. There's a big black patch called axillary feathers, and they're always black no matter what the plumage is, whether it's an adult black-bellied or an immature in flight. You're always going to see the black axillary armpit area feathers. Now, we have a juvenile black-bellied plover. Keep this in mind. The golden plovers have a more distinct cap and white eye stripe. So if I go back, notice the cap kind of blends in with the white eye stripe. But when we go next to our golden plover, look how distinct that cap is on the adult with a bold white line above the eye. And the same with the young juvenile. The cap is a lot more distinct, and that eye stripe makes a big contrast. And then sometimes, even on the juvenile, you might be able to see a little bit of yellow tinge or golden flecking on a juvenile bird. So snowy plover, this was discovered by the two piping plover techs at the state park. I forget the name of the fellow who originally found it. He wasn't positive, but he contacted Chris Lips, who verified it as a snowy plover. And there's only like 4 records ever. So we had people from around the state to see that bird on the lake shore south of the river. Semi-palmated plover we see fairly often in migration. Notice it has a lot of what I call scalloping on the upper parts, the back and the wings. That's typical of a lot of shorebirds that are juvenile. In flight, pretty distinct, has a little bit of a white wing stripe, very bold single collar as opposed to a killdeer with two collars. Now, notice how much paler the piping plover is. It's even paler than sand to some degree. This happens to be a banded bird, of course, and this was on the South Breakwater some years ago. And then for a juvenile bird, they look considerably different. If you had a juvenile piping plover and a snowy plover together, you might think they're related because they look kind of similar. But the bill is bigger on the snowy plover. Our last plover, or next to last, is a killdeer. It's fanning its feathers as a distraction. I was probably close to its nest or its young. Here it's flying away, pretty bold color pattern. You can imagine if there's a predator out there, it would go after the adult, and of course the adult killdeer is luring away any predator or human. Very attractive in flight. You have a fast shutter speed. Okay, now to sandpipers and phalaropes. One of our largest sandpipers happens to be the upland sandpiper, which doesn't breed anywhere near water necessarily. And this is at the airport, the Mason County Airport. It's been hard to get photos of these birds because they don't allow you to get too close. Of course, they breed at the airport, so during the breeding season, they're going to be a little more wary anyway. But this is amazing. How many books show you a upland sandpiper in flight, especially from below? That tail, just who would have known has such a gorgeous tail. So that's pretty neat. Here's one of my nemesis. I still have not seen a whimbrel. There are only like 4 records, 4 or 5. Their migration peaks in spring right around Memorial Day. So that's the best time to check the South Breakwater, but of course, with the high lake levels, the lower walkways and the boulders that used to be visible are not there. So it's not quite as friendly for migrating shorebirds nowadays. But notice the long down curved bill. That's very distinctive for the whimbrel, plus the bluish legs and a striped crown. That's a pretty good sized bird, by the way. A bird that I discovered last spring, a year ago. This is a photo by Linda Scribner. When the wings are up, you can see the beautiful salmon color underneath the wings. When the wings are folded, it's a mottled light brown bird, kind of blends in with its background. But notice that the bill is long and upturned on godwits. And I don't have a really good photo of the Hudsonian godwit, but it would look very similar, but just darker overall. Ruddy turnstone is a very colorful bird. There's only one turnstone species we expect in the interior of the continent. That bill is short and sturdy. It allows them to flip stones over or turn stones over. And when they do that on a beach, they'll eat the invertebrates that they find underneath the stone. So it's a perfect name for the bird. And ruddy being reddish color in breeding plumage like this bird. The juveniles, of course, are not nearly as colorful, but just by looking at the shape of the bird, the pointed bill, you can pretty well figure those are ruddy turnstones that are young. Red knot is a very rare bird. We don't see annually. We do see turnstones almost every year, spring or fall. Red knots, on average, about every 3 or 4 years, we'll see a red knot. So that's a very rare bird. This bird is not fully in its breeding plumage. It's getting a little bit faded, but in breeding plumage, it would be a darker, almost brick red. But even though this is a medium-sized shorebird with a medium-sized bill, most of the time when we see red knots, they're in the juvenile plumage, which is just stunning. I like to get this bird perched on one leg with its wing out, a little bit different than a normal photo. But you'll notice scalloping, this white fringes on the wing feathers. It's just beautiful, and that helps identify that also as a red knot. Okay, now we're starting to get to other medium-sized shorebirds. The stilt sandpiper, usually we see a few each year, but again, with fewer habitat areas for shorebirds in general, we might not be seeing stilts every year until we start getting lower lake levels. One thing to notice on stilts, they have a pretty prominent white eye stripe above the eye, and they're about the size of a lesser yellowleg, so they're a pretty good sized bird. So in this photo here, the stilt is this lower, larger bird. And you can see, even here, you can see the white eye stripe shows up. And notice all the white on the tail, the upper tail there. And by the way, if this was a yellow legs, the legs would extend a lot further out and they'd be pretty boldly yellow. These other birds, smaller ones, are probably at least in semi-palmated sandpipers, I'm guessing. Sanderlings are a lot less common in spring, so when we do see them, they're a lot darker red. I don't have a photo of sanderlings in spring, so it's an adult that's losing a lot of its reddish orange feathers from the breeding season. Another adult with not nearly as much red, getting closer to its winter plumage. And then this is what everybody sees in the fall. It's probably the most common shorebird, even with lake levels high. You're still going to see sanderlings. They don't seem to mind people at all compared to other shorebirds. So you'll see them like at Stearns Park, and you can walk up within 5 birds and get photos easy. The other thing is they're the most black and white color of any of our small shorebirds, and they have a habit of running very fast, almost like a wind-up toy, following the ebb and flow of the water and the waves, looking for invertebrates. And here we have a sleeping juvenile. One thing I might point out, it has some of its winter plumage already. These gray feathers right here, those will be dominant when the bird is totally in winter plumage. All the feathers on the wings and back will be that color instead of the darker color. And in flight, the sanderling has one of the strongest white wing stripes of any shorebird, especially any small or medium-sized shorebird. So that is one good key to be aware of. Dunlins are pretty cool birds. We see a few of them in spring. In fact, their former name was red-backed sandpiper, which is not a bad name, but I guess the decision was made to return to another term, Dunlin, and at the moment I can't recall how that name came about, but for such a small chunky bird, they have a long, very long down curved bill, and in any plumage, that long down curved bill should be a clue as to whether you have a Dunlin or not. And you can see a dozen or more of these during peak migration, and this would be around Labor Day each year. This is one of my favorite Dunlin slides, and I've used it for happy birthday cards to friends. I can give a caption, obviously, with a wise crack or whatever. Now, here we have a juvenile. Looks a little bit different, and this is in midsummer. Right about now is when Dunlins that are the young birds are starting to come back. So they look considerably different, but notice that bill, it kind of gives it away. Of course, you can't see the bill when they're sleeping or trying to sleep. And then the last photo of Dunlins, they're very winter hardy, not quite as hardy as the purple sandpiper, but here's November 9th, and I had a flock of like 60 in different waves flying south. And you can see that it was pretty windy there on Lake Michigan. And speaking of purple sandpiper, one of my favorite birds, this is the dominant plumage, and they're almost all young birds, first winter birds, and we see them in November or December. You can see white scalloping again, which indicates it's a young bird. Notice the bill is orangish at the base and then black through the rest of the bill. That's very typical. That this almost the same size as a Dunlin, and their bill is kind of long, but a Dunlin will never have orangish on the bill at all. One year, you might recall, in March, we had 80-degree temperatures, and we also had a purple sandpiper that overwintered the entire winter. And there's one reason that happened, is there was virtually no ice on the breakwaters at the harbor. And you might ask, well, what does ice have to do with the shorebird? Well, when the ice covers the boulders where the shorebirds were getting or trying to get invertebrates in the algae on the boulders, once the boulders freeze over, they can't do that. So it was fortunate there was almost no ice, and you can see this purple sandpiper is transitioning to a breeding plumage, which is almost unheard of. And I don't know that purple sandpiper's ever been found further north than this anywhere in the state. And this is interesting. It's hard to tell probably to some of you, but I can see the feet, the orange feet below the water, just barely in the shadow. So this bird is wading in the water, which is kind of odd to see. It looks like it might be swimming, but it's actually wading. If you're real lucky, I saw 4 purple sandpipers at the same time, and usually it's only 1 or 2 at a time, but December 18th in 2011, I could not believe it. There were 4 of them. And you can see they're looking through the filamentous algae for invertebrates. We're getting down to the last group of sandpipers. Of the birds that are called peeps or small sandpipers, the Baird's is one of the larger ones. And not only it's larger than least and semi-palmated, but the wing feathers extend a little bit beyond the tail feathers. And that happens to be the same case with the white-rumped sandpiper, which we'll see after this. By the way, Baird's sandpipers are almost unheard of in spring anywhere in the Great Lakes. Their migration goes through the Great Plains in the spring, so we see them almost exclusively in the fall, and all of our records are totally just fall records. Another thing on Baird's, it has a little bit of a breast band. Here's another view. You can see a heavy breast band, scalloping on the wings, indicating young bird. And you can see the wings are, here's the end of the tail, here's the end of the wing feathers, the primaries. And here we have a view of the front of the Baird's. Least sandpiper. This is our smallest sandpiper. The legs are variable from light gray to green to yellow. In breeding plumage, they'd be bright yellow. With a young bird, this is kind of yellowish gray. But the young bird would have a lot of rufous, as you can see on the wings of that. A young semi-palmated sandpiper would be the same size. It would not be reddish. Here's a good view of the red, black, and white. Beautiful, beautiful plumage close up. And this is what it looks like when you have a breeding bird. Here, the legs on this bird are a little more yellowish. Now, this is my worst photo because of it's not sharp, but you can see least looks to be a little smaller than the semi-palmated on the right. The other thing with least, their bill is slightly downturned. With semi-palmated, the bill is perfectly straight. Semi-palmated have grayish to black legs, paler legs on least, and more colorful on the back. So these are all good characters to separate least and semi-palmated. We'll have another photo of semi-palmated a little further later. The other large peep with a long wing feathers is the white-rumped sandpiper, which does have a big white rump in flight. And it also has stripes. You can barely see some little gray stripes on the flanks, which helps identify it. Here we have a young, or an adult, I should say, young adult in molt, midsummer here. Looks a little different, but again, you can see the wings are just slightly longer than the tail. And you can see some striping on the side here. Here's a juvenile, again, white scalloping on the wings. And this was a really rare bird. This was the wastewater treatment plant, and it was in winter plumage, so it's a very gray bird. But notice it still has that big white wing patch, which for a small shorebird, no other small shorebird has that. Buff-breasted sandpiper, one of our larger, medium-sized, I guess, shorebirds. Almost all of our buff-breasteds are going to be fall birds. And so they're going to have that bold scalloping, which is quite attractive. And they're very buffy colored overall on the neck and the breast especially. This bird is foraging. This is actually the lawn right by the Loomis Street parking area to the south there. Normally they're at the breakwaters. Now we're going back to a little bit larger bird, the pectoral sandpiper. This is a medium-sized bird. Pectoral means breast, so you can see it has bold breast striping, and it has yellowish, greenish legs. And for a bird that's medium-sized, that's pretty distinctive. This is just showing a pectoral with its wings up, which makes it look a little bigger, but the bird to the left is a greater yellow legs, so it's considerably bigger. It appears the bird below is probably a least sandpiper because it's very reddish in the wings there in the back. Okay, so if you were to see a pectoral sandpiper and a white rump, pectoral is going to be larger, but notice there's a big black bar in between white feathers on either side, so you're not going to have a solid white patch there. Semi-palmated sandpiper. I have some good photos here. As I mentioned in the earlier slide, the bill is straight compared to a least, and the legs are almost always darker. We have another view here, and you can, semi-palmated actually means half webbed. So their toes have partial webbing, like a duck, but only partial. And the best photo is coming up here. Okay, this is about as red you're ever going to see a semi-palmated. So at least be a lot redder. But the next slide, well, it looks good if you can zoom in. I think, yeah, here we go. Partially webbed toes. You can see that pretty easily here. That's pretty amazing. If you've never had them at a perfect vantage, you're looking down, you can see that webbing. But if you're 30 feet away or 150 feet away with a scope, you're probably not going to have that angle to see the webbing. So that's how the bird got its name. Here's some birds in flight. And from above, again, they have a pretty bold wing stripe. And we have a group of semi-palmateds here in flight. Dowitcher, both dowitchers are rare. Long-billed is far rarer, but even short-billed, we don't necessarily see those every year. And breeding plumage, like this bird pretty much is, they're going to be a light brick red with a white eye stripe above the eye and a fairly long bill. And their feeding action is straight up and down vertically. So it reminds people of a sewing machine action as far as how they feed compared to other shorebirds. Yeah, this is a little closer bird. This is actually at near the mouth of the Sable River at the park. And then just a fall or two ago, Matt McConnell found this dowitcher, and it took us a lot of study to figure out it was a long bill because there's overlap when it comes to the length of the bill on dowitchers. But we had to look through technical books, and You can see some of these feathers in here on the coverts. They're dark with a little rufous fringe, and that occurs only on the juvenile long-billed dowitcher. If this was a juvenile short-billed, there'd be, I believe, dark lines through each of those feathers as well. And another vantage point here. A lot of us have kicked up woodcock accidentally. And if you're lucky, you might see some breeding birds. I'm not sure if this male was displaying because I was close to a nest or what. Normally their tail is not going to be poking up like that unless they're courting a female about her death. Years ago, when I was doing my work with the Forest Service, I came upon a woodcock nest. And the nest happened to be at the edge of a red pine stand, believe it or not. But that red pine stand was bordering an open meadow. So that open meadow is where the woodcock would do its courtship. And the edge of the woods was where the nest was. Normally their nest is going to be in a thicket. And then at the state park, we had a hen or a female woodcock leading her brood across the road, the main entrance road, or park road. And this was pretty dangerous. And you can see a couple young chicks there in the background, in the upper left. And unfortunately, there was some teenager just driving through, and female got out of the way, but some of the young didn't quite survive, even though I was trying to wave that person to stop. One chick that did survive. Fortunately, this family was nowhere near a road. This was last spring, I believe. Yeah. I was out in Custer Township with Susie Knoll, and we were just looking around, following a trail, and we came upon a female woodcock with some young, which are considerably older. We thought, based on comments from our expert woodcock bander, that he says he thought these were maybe a week old. And I believe there were 3 of the young. Pretty amazing camouflage, even for the young woodcock. Snipe, it's fairly closely related to woodcock, but it definitely is in a different genus. Not quite as brown and colorful. But then notice the snipe tends to be in areas where it's more beneficial to be a heavily striped bird. And this was a late snowfall in April, a couple of springs ago, up by Freeman Road Marsh. If you've never seen a juvenile snipe, notice how reddish the head is. Other than that, it might be difficult to tell whether you have a snipe, it's an adult, in just various plumages. And then in winter here, this is late winter, obviously, but my favorite little thermal spring up on Upper Hamlin Lake there, we had 3 or 4 snipe, which might have overwintered because March 15th is still a little on the early side up here. But This is January 30th, which is usually pretty cold, and I flushed 3 snipe. You can see that the bill's pretty long in flight, and it's pretty cool to see the different flight patterns. That middle pattern kind of resembles an Audubon painting. Um, so they're pretty distinctive in flight, even if you don't hear their distinctive call notes. Spotted sandpiper, perfect name for that. Heavily spotted on the adults, which is one of our medium-sized shorebirds. Young spotted sandpiper looks considerably different. Doesn't have a lot of scalloping, or at least white scalloping. It has some subtle scalloping on it. Very bold white eye ring. It looks considerably different from the adults. And it's one of our few shorebirds that breeds in the area. In flight, it has a little bit of a white wing stripe. This is still a juvenile bird. Solitary sandpiper, they're medium large, almost as big as a lesser yellowleg, not quite. They have a pretty bold white eye ring, and then compared to yellowlegs, their back and wings are a lot darker, more contrast, and very much whiter underneath than yellowlegs. But the next photo is just stunning. I just love this photo. The wings turned out nice and sharp. So it's like, well, who would have known, unless you had a fast shutter speed, that there's interesting patterns underneath the wings as well. So it's one of my favorite photos of a solitary. Okay, again, notice we don't have a solid white tail here. We have a dark band in between, plus some cross banding, but that would help separate it from some other medium-sized birds. Lesser yellowlegs here. Typically, the bill is about the same length as the width of the head. And of course, the legs are yellowish. Now here we have lesser yellowlegs next to a spotted sandpiper, and you can see the legs are considerably bigger, and the bird overall is a lot bigger. Lesser yellowlegs, pretty large bird, but compared to white rump sandpiper, you're not going to confuse the two because the birds are so much different in size. But on the other hand, even though this has a white tail, it doesn't have a white rump. It's a paler rump. But on the white rump sandpiper, the tail is slightly darker and it's more contrasty. And these appear to be young yellowlegs. I don't know what they were squabbling about. Could have been some food or something, but I got some photos of some interesting interaction here. Here with the greater, the bill is slightly longer than the width of the head. And of course, if you had other birds around it, as I mentioned in my book, a greater yellowlegs, if it wanted to, could walk over a killdeer, whereas a lesser yellowlegs could not. So that gives you an idea of how much larger a greater is than a lesser. Unfortunately, the bill doesn't show well in this photo because of the background. And you can see the legs sometimes are actually almost a orangish, but if they're a really bold orange, keep an eye out for rough. The immature ruffs have orange legs. However, they have big, bold spotting on the throat and breast, which neither yellowlegs has large, dark spots. So even though I don't have a photo of a ruff, think of a ruff as being an orange-legged yellow legs with big spots on the breast and throat. If you see one of those, call me immediately. Willet, very distinct species. Those of us that go to Florida for the winter or other times of the year, there's a species of willet that does not migrate and just stays on the Florida coast and the Atlantic coast, and they breed there. They're there year round. We have a western subspecies that migrates through the Great Lakes up into the upper Great Plains, from the Dakotas on into central Canada. Very large shorebird, bluish gray legs, very long, stout bill, pretty mottled gray and black plumage. But when you see the wings, well, here we have a group. Normally we'll see 2 or 3 willets at a time. If you're lucky, you might see 6 or 8. However, in flight, there's no other shorebird of any size that has big, bold, black and white striping on the flight feathers, which are the primaries here. Here we have a willet in juvenile plumage. So it's a young bird, looks completely different except that stout gray bill and a gray legs combined with a pretty large shorebird helps to identify this. Of course, if it flies off, you'll see the black and white thing very distinctly. We're almost done. We're down to the phalaropes, which is the last group of shorebirds. Phalaropes are really bizarre. The males actually incubate the eggs, all 3 species of phalaropes. Because of that, females are more colorful than the males. Because the males have to incubate, the males are very drab in color. And the only phalarope that breeds in the Great Lakes, including Michigan, is the Wilson's phalarope, which is a breeder, even in Michigan, is still very rare as a breeder. It's the most colorful, perhaps, of our phalaropes. And here we just have a bird in silhouette here. Usually, we were starting to see Wilson's phalaropes every spring for a couple years in a row at the wastewater plant, and then they just haven't showed up in recent years. And this isn't very close, but you can see that the male just isn't very colorful. Okay, now juvenile birds and winter adults of the redneck phalarope are not going to be colorful with a reddish neck, but the pattern of striping on the back helps separate this from a young or a winter plumage red phalarope. So the rednecks are very rare, and we've only got a couple records of those. This was 2017. We had up to 2 juvenile birds. All phalaropes tend to feed in very shallow water. This is off one of the breakwaters, the South Breakwater. And they're weird for other reasons. They don't mind swimming. And the redneck and the red phalarope are more pelagic, which means you'll find them in deeper waters in migration, where they can just feed off insects that are floating on or near the surface of waters, even out into the ocean. And they, in real shallow water, if their feet can touch the substrate, they will actually whirl in circles to stir up the substrate so that they can then poke their head down and hopefully grab some invertebrates that were mixed up or pulled up from twirling around in circles. So phalaropes are just amazing birds. Another photo. It's got something in its bill. Even when I enlarged it, I couldn't quite tell. That might have been a small clam, perhaps. Here it is out on the edge of the lower walkway before it got flooded. So they look a little weird out of the water. And then lastly, only one record of red phalarope, and Bob Mormon and I on November 7th, 2009 were participating in the I guess they call it the Shoreline bird count along Lake Michigan. There were about a dozen stations all the way from Berrien to Benzie County, and the methodology required that we be there at sunrise, and we happened to hit big Sable points, so even though it was November, that means you have to get up, allow for a half-hour hike with a tripod, scope, binoculars, backpack, bird guide, water, maybe lunch, because you're going to be there 2 or 3 hours. So fortunately, while I was out counting loons with my scope, Bob had his binoculars looking along the shoreline for gulls nearby, and he looked to the north of Lighthouse and saw this bird fluttering. It was just hovering off the shore. And Bob said right immediately, he said, "I think we might have a phalarope here." When I heard that, I just stopped counting loons, immediately scanned with my scope, and when he mentioned phalarope, I knew it was too late for Wilson's. It had to be either red or redneck. And I could see the back had no striping through it at all. And I knew immediately it was a red phalarope, but I was nowhere near getting a photo. I then just interrupted my count, ran with my camera, and the bird was hovering 30 feet off the shoreline. And the weird thing is, these phalaropes, and especially in this plumage, look at that bill. The rest of the bird kind of looks like a gull, but the bill looks like a shorebird. So if there's a case that can be made, phalaropes are kind of half gull and half shorebird in a lot of manners, especially with being able to rest on the water and float like they were a gull. So I think that might be my last slide. And just a couple other thoughts that right now the high lake level of Lake Michigan is making it very difficult for us to have good shorebird habitat. So the other thing would be, this is hopefully cyclical. Hopefully water will go down in Lake Michigan the next couple of years, because a lot of these shorebirds, they'll allow you to get within 20 feet, but the trouble is when you have the lower walkways flooded, there's nowhere to go, because that upper central walkway is only about 15, 20 feet wide. When the water levels were down, you could be walking on top with a dog, and these shorebirds could go off the lower walkway or onto a boulder to feel a little more safe, but they can't do that right now. And of course, shorebird migration is always precarious because in the spring, oftentimes they'll stop where they see flooded croplands and shallow ponds. But if it's a dry spring, they might have very few places to stop, which means they might not even stop anywhere in this part of the state and might just continue migrating. The other thing is shorebirds can migrate during the day and night. So if you're looking for shorebirds, keep in mind that often there's a midday drop of shorebirds into really good habitat. So if you're checking a good habitat area in the morning, it might be worth checking it midday because there can be a total turnover in shorebirds. As you might imagine, because shorebirds fly often hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles, there's great mortality from year to year, and especially with young birds that are not accustomed to migrating. So in conclusion, the 3 best shorebird references that I own, at least in my opinion, the Shorebird Guide is probably number 1. It's the most recent guide. It has a lot of excellent photos. Shorebirds of North America, even though it's only a year older, also has photos, but not nearly as many as the Shorebird Guide. And then lastly, the book all of us were relying on decades ago, which still has some good information. These are paintings, excellent illustrations of various plumages, Shorebirds, an identification guide to waders of the world, in 1986. So if you really are hooked on shorebirds, that Shorebird Guide to Waders of the World might be of some benefit as well. So I think that should be it for the program.
Thank you, Dave.
Okie doke.
That was wonderful.
So yeah, I don't know if we have any people asking questions.
I don't see any in the list of chat. But there's a couple comments from Jim Galley.
Okay.
Can you see those, Dave, or you want me to read them?
No, Jim's photo doesn't show up. And how do I see the comments? Oh, there's Jim.
Okay, I just wanted to mention, I did mention in the comments that you talked about the snowy plovers and the photograph taken by Chris Lips of the juvenile snowy plover. And Chris has since moved to Alabama and the Gulf Coast and spent a few years studying snowy plover. So it's kind of an interesting connection there.
Right, right.
And also, you had asked about Dunlin, wondering where that term came from. And dun means brownish gray, and ling means little. That was an Old English term from the 1500s. And so they shortened that to Dunlin.
Cool. Well, yeah, I couldn't do my research online. I'm glad you did that, Jim.
Does anyone else have any questions? You can unmute your microphone if you have any questions for Dave.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Oh, sorry. Somebody else did?
Oh, go for it, Dave.
Yeah, this
Okay,
is Dave Waltz, partner of Jim Galley and his crew of birders at the bird count each year. And forgive me, I've been giving myself a haircut while watching, but does anyone have a sense for where the word phalarope came from? It's a very interesting word.
Don't think I've looked that up before. I will mention the phalaropes. I'm not sure there's any other phalaropes on the whole planet other than those three. The other thing is of some interest, because there's a role reversal with tending to the young. There have been some women's groups that have developed their own phalarope society, which I guess probably might have been a bigger deal decades ago when men did not tend to their kids as well as some of them do now, and sharing the raising of the kids. I don't know if that society still exists, but
Seems like a Greek word, but no, I thank you. I appreciate. I've never considered the hybridization, not hybridization, but rather the behavior that's similar to both a shorebird and a gull. So that was very fascinating.
that's how I see it. Now, of course, they're not related to gulls at all, but still, it's like, it looks like somebody, when they wanted to design a bird, said, well, let's make a bird that's half gull and half shorebird.
Well, it looks like phalarope it means coot toad because they have lobed feet similar to a coot.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Hey, any other questions out there?
Linda Scribner says, wonderful program. Thank you, Dave.
Ah,
Thank you, everyone. This is my first Zoom participation. I feel like I just came out of my cave.
well, I hope I paced this okay, because this is the first time I've done this on Zoom. So I guess I didn't take an hour and a half, so that's probably good.
This is a wonderful outreach. This is great. I'm glad we did this. If there is no more questions, I'm going to say the meeting's over. I think, did we have success recording this, Jim?
Yes,